Hello, everyone. Welcome to the monthly Florida Food Forum hosted by the Policy Committee of the Council. I am Del Deschamps, acting chair of the committee. With us from the Council is the Council's Administrator, Kendra Love. Kendra will be handling the technical and managerial aspects of our meeting. I'm also asking Kendra to let us know when the session will close and give us an alert when we have 5 minutes left. Our topic for this month is relevant to all Floridians and especially those interested in the Florida food system generally and specifically, statewide and locally. The topic is water, food, and society, and the title for the forum is aptly chosen, Murky Waters. Murky Waters will engage the Florida food system and broader issues in ecology, society, governmental structures, and really the zeitgeist of contemporary American culture. Thanks as always for joining us. A document introducing our presenter for today is posted on the Council's blog site. And if you registered for the event, you have seen the introduction. Today, we're delighted to welcome Florida Food Policy Board member Christopher Johns to leadership of our forum. Christopher is a native Floridian and the son of a fourth-generation farmer with farming experience himself. His personal story and his family story is a Florida narrative from start to end. He comes to us as a native of our state from the small old Florida town of Hastings, a graduate of the University of Florida with a Juris Doctorate from UF as well. You can find much more information about Christopher's background on the Florida Food Policy Council's blog for today's event. His career path has led him to service as an environmental attorney with a wide range of clients, membership on our board of directors, and to this very moment today, when he will present insights into our relationship with water, food, and society. Following Chris's presentation will be an opportunity for questions and discussion. And before going further, let me invite everyone here today to consider joining Florida Food Policy Council. You will find information about membership on the website. And so as I turn things over to Christopher, I ask that he tell us a little bit about himself and what inspired him to commit himself to his career and the path that brings him here today. And so with pleasure, we welcome Christopher Johns.
Thanks, Del. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, as you mentioned, I'm a native Floridian. I grew up in Northeast Florida, and as you alluded to, kind of an old Florida town, Hastings. And that town basically started kind of as a spur, or it came to prominence, as you could, if you can call it prominence, as a spur of the Henry Flagler Railroad. And it's a kind of a cool little climate where they found that you could grow a lot of fruits and vegetables relatively early in the year. And so, it developed into a primarily agricultural community. And my family has been there for several generations. And before I decided to go to law school, I was the fifth generation in my family to help manage our farm. And at the time, it was primarily potatoes. Since I've become an attorney, we've transitioned to sod, citrus, and some cattle. And it was my experience helping manage the farm that really kind of got me interested in water and water issues, and kind of led me to pursue a law degree. And water is really interesting because it's a very basic fundamental thing that plays a fundamental role in our society and has allowed us to develop, into the society that we see today. And so, the path that has led us to this level of development and interconnectedness around the world, has been built in large part on having access to abundant amounts of water and clean water that is safe to grow food as well as drink. And we are approaching a point where we're starting to test the limits of our water supplies. And because of kind of the characteristics of water and how it just exists in the world, the protection and regulation of it as a resource is incredibly complex, and it brings up some issues that are really interesting from the fact that it kind of shows us how interconnected we are, and but that requires kind of a greater understanding of each other and our neighbors, and even neighbors in the sense of a state away or a country away, rather than right next door, house next to your street. So agriculture, like there's not a thing in agriculture that doesn't require water to grow. So in addition to needing water for people to drink, we also need it for our food production. And I think according to the USDA, I think about 80% of the consumptive uses of water that we use in the United States are used for agricultural production. That's quite a bit of water. And so when we talk about sustainable future and sustainable water resources, agriculture is a big part of that conversation. And it has kind of there's a lot of sides to that. One, folks that are growing food, are feeding people, which is, very noble and an admirable pursuit. But at the same time, as agriculture has developed over the years, there's a lot of, secondary impacts and consequences to our methods of production, that we have to deal with. And in order to deal with it in a way that's, constructive, that requires a certain amount of patience and understanding amongst everyone involved. And, I mentioned before that water ties us together in kind of interesting ways. And it's only really within probably the last generation or so that we've really truly come to grips with what that means and all the ways that it happens. And, a good example that I like to point to is that, you take the city of Atlanta. They use a lot of water. It's developed into a major U.S. city. And their water consumption has a direct impact on Apalachicola's oyster production. That's a couple hundred miles down away and across a state boundary. But, those two localities, those two, communities are interconnected because of water use. And those issues, anyone who's familiar with the tri-state water rights litigation, that it's a really complex situation. And in between Atlanta and Apalachicola is a whole bunch of agricultural land, along with other cities. And, they all depend upon water, along those water bodies to use for, their day-to-day lives and their means of, earning a living. And if there's one thing I hope that everyone can get from this talk is a sense of just how complex these issues are, and that you can leave the conversation, and in the future when you hear people talking about these issues, and you hear people trying to boil them down to very kind of binary type dichotomies, I hope that y'all can gain a little bit of understanding that in the overwhelming majority of instances, the situations and the issues that people are trying to grapple with are much more complex. And hopefully, we can all gain a little greater sense of empathy and patience for, trying to solve these issues. All right, so that's kind of my introduction to the topic and what I hope to talk about. So let me see. I want to go over a couple little bullet points over why protecting our water resources is so difficult, but important. So if we remove water or alter its characteristics in the wrong way, it affects a lot more than just our immediate area and more than ourselves. I already explained the connection between Atlanta and Apalachicola. The same is true for any flowing water body, and even the connection between surface waters and groundwaters. Florida has largely karst geography, and that's a very porous geologic formation, and it allows for our aquifers and the beautiful springs we have. But it also means that in many places, if we're injecting stuff into the ground, that might bubble up somewhere downstream where people are swimming or where people are irrigating their crops. And the reverse is the same too. If we do stuff above the surface of the water, that could also impact the quality of the water down below, or the ability of those underground water resources to actually recharge. And so we might lose that if we're not careful. It's part of that problem. Water's not stationary, and I've already kind of mentioned this before too, but it doesn't follow political boundaries. So that requires solutions that can create weird legal jurisdictional questions and presents difficult situations, but also it opens an opportunity maybe for more creative solutions. That's the way I like to look at it, at least. And then, so the next, I want to give you a brief overview of how we regulate water in the U.S. There's typically 3 levels of regulation. There's regulation at the federal level, at the state level, and then kind of what we generally call the local level. So that's like counties and municipalities. States themselves have primacy over water use and regulation. So states have the authority to generally control who uses water and how it's used. The federal government has limited authority under certain areas, and these have certain kind of roots in the U.S. Constitution, but things that affect commerce and then disputes amongst the states, the federal government, we usually look to them to handle it. So a couple big areas that most people are familiar with where the federal government takes charge is water pollution. They set drinking water standards, and they regulate a lot of aspects of wetlands, wetland use, and wetland protection. So I want to talk about, that's kind of a real quick overview. States, at the state level, there is some shared regulatory responsibility it's cooperative, and a good example of that is under the Clean Water Act. The federal government sets kind of big regulatory framework guidelines, and then states hopefully implement kind of the details and the nuance of that. So in the case of water quality, the federal government says each state you have to create water quality standards, and under the Clean Water Act. And so the states will, they basically have to set their standards, and the federal government comes back and checks that and makes sure that it meets kind of the minimum requirements. All right, so that's kind of a general idea of the players and the relationships. I want to talk next about kind of the areas that of our water resources that we regulate that, in my mind, are probably most important when it comes to maintaining a sustainable source of water for everything. So the first are watersheds. Watersheds are important because that's how essentially where our water resources come from. They most often provide the ecological functions that clean water and replenish our sources of lakes and streams and aquifer and groundwater sources. There's two good examples of how we do this in the state. One are protecting wetlands, as I mentioned, and another is setting minimum flows and levels. I'm going to talk about these in a little more detail a little bit later. The second important area is water quality. So if you've got water, that's great, but if it's not clean water, if you can't drink it, if it's going to make you sick if you drink it, then that doesn't really do anyone much good. So you might be able to grow some plants. That's good, but another is drinking water standards, and then water quality standards for human health. There's a little bit of nuance there. So there are different health concerns when you're talking about water that's fit for drinking versus water that is fit, to say take a bath in or swim in, and that's kind of the distinction there. But the federal government sets those guidelines, and then states implement them. Okay, so 3 areas: watersheds, water quality, and water use. Because you got to protect the source, you got to protect the quality, and you got to make sure that we're using it in a sustainable way. So, watershed protection. Let's see. First, I'll talk about wetlands. I already mentioned that they play a very critical role in most ecosystems, and especially with water supplies and cleaning water and replenishing aquifers and things like that. Also, I'm sure there are people who would remind me that they also provide critical habitat for a lot of important species. And let's see. So in our state, well, let's see. At the federal level, the Clean Water Act provides one of the main sources of regulation for wetlands, and that's Section 404 of the Clean Water Act has to deal with dredge and fill permitting, and that's typically, so the Clean Water Act regulates waters of the U.S., but that term also encompasses wetland areas too, and there's massive controversy over just how far that definition, that jurisdictional extent goes. But generally, everyone pretty much recognizes that wetlands are critical to our water supply and our water sources. So the Clean Water Act provides some protection for them. How much is constantly fought over, but that is one thing everyone can agree on. So at the federal level, it's Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. At the state level, we also regulate wetlands, and that's covered under Chapter 373, which covers most of Florida's water resources. And the Florida Department of Environmental Protection is the agency in charge of that, but the individual water management districts also share some responsibility in the regulation and permitting of impacts to wetlands. And they have the state has its own definition of what wetlands are, and for delineating the areas that require permits to impact than the federal government. And actually, the state of Florida is undergoing a process right now to try and combine the regulating authority or the permitting kind of processing and take responsibility up from the Corps of Engineers so they can do everything. And their thought is to streamline it and make it a little bit less cumbersome for people. That's ongoing, and has not been done yet, but it is a complicated process. Let me see. Is there anything else I want to talk about on wetlands? No. So that's generally it. There's a federal role for wetland regulation and a state role for wetland regulation. The other way we protect our watersheds is through what are called minimum flows and levels. And so that basically is a state law that says water management districts, and along with DEP have to set minimum flows and minimum levels for virtually all water bodies, surface and groundwater. That's under 373, if anyone's interested. So a minimum flow is, it's a legal definition, but generally it's the minimum, I guess, it's a limit at which if you withdraw any more water from that water body, it would cause significant harm. And, that's a definition, a very technical definition in and of itself, but that's the general idea. Minimum levels, similarly, are the level, like a water level at which for either groundwater or surface waters, again, if you were to withdraw more, it would cause significant harm to either the area or the ecology of the area. So that's kind of generally the two big areas where we protect our watersheds. Some other ways that watersheds get protection is through the Endangered Species Act and also the Clean Air Act. A lot of issues with water, both kind of in the watershed and in the water quality picture, come from atmospheric deposition of chemicals or other pollutants, and that's a real big problem. And we could talk for hours about that in and of itself, but I just want to let y'all know those are other things that may interact. Okay, so water quality is the next one. How do we regulate water quality? Most water quality is handled at the federal level. So the Clean Water Act and as well as the Safe Drinking Water Act are two of the big federal sources of regulatory authority. I mentioned that the Clean Water Act is a statute that allows, gives roles to both the federal government and the states. But what the Clean Water Act says for regulating water quality is that states, you have to create water quality standards and enforce them. And water quality standards generally have three components. So the first are designated uses, then there's water quality criteria, and then there's what's kind of known as an anti-degradation policy. And so designated uses are what it sounds. States look at all their bodies of water and they say, this is what we want this water to be used for. And so once they've set that use, they also have to set water quality criteria for that use and for that water body. So, the kind of baseline level is fishable, swimmable. So what levels, what pollutants, are pollutant levels are safe to have in a water body that people generally use for fishing and swimming. So there's all sorts of numeric and narrative criteria associated with a whole list of different pollutants, but states have that responsibility. And then the third component is the anti-degradation policy, and that gets pretty technical and weedsy, but generally the intent and the focus of that is to say, okay, once we've attained a level of water quality that is good and safe for a designated use, this is our policy to make sure that we maintain that level over time and it doesn't degrade in the future. So as part of that, the way the Clean Water Act kind of enforces, and implements this is that states have to, once they set these standards, then they monitor whether the water is impaired for any number of these water quality criteria. And if it becomes impaired, then that creates a responsibility for other actions, and states will have to set what's called a total maximum daily load for that pollutant. And it's basically a remediation type program that is the goal of which is to clean the water up of the pollutant. In addition, the Clean Water Act, regulates discharges into water. So that's where hear about the NPDES permits, which is National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And that basically, if you discharge into a water of the U.S., that requires a permit. It's a little more complex than that, but generally it requires a permit to make sure that the stuff that you're discharging into a water body doesn't cause degradation over time, and it's not going to pollute the water body. Okay. So then you have Safe Drinking Water Act is a similar kind of thing. The EPA will set guidelines basically for standards for what's essentially amounts to safe drinking water. And then states have to implement that, and the EPA monitors that whole process. Similarly, still, the EPA also publishes what are called human health-based water quality criteria. And those look at specific pollutants that can cause harm to people if they exceed certain levels in water. And EPA sets recommendations, and states have responsibility to implement water quality standards that are conform with that. Okay, so I talked about watershed protection, so that's kind of protecting the bodies themselves and the way they get replenished. Water quality, which is almost purely chemical. We're looking at whether the water is safe for the ways that we want to or need to use it. And then finally, the third area is water use. So as it sounds, how do we use the water? We use water for everything. Some things are essential, drinking, growing food. Some things are probably, less essential. Beautification of, our neighborhoods and our lawns, watering, having water fountains and things like that. And so this is the universe that these regulations kind of inhabit. So there's two types of water use regulation that I just want to mention. The main two are consumptive use permits and surface water management permits, or as they're called now, environmental resource permits. And so consumptive use permits are exactly what you would think. They allow someone to use a specific quantity of water from a certain body, whether a lake, a stream, a canal, or the groundwater. And the water management districts have the regulatory authority for this permitting program. Second one is surface water management permits, and there's a bunch of different categories, but generally, when we develop land or when we do anything with our land, whether it's farming or any type of recreational activity or building office buildings or whatever, we're going to impact. There's a good chance we're going to impact how the water flows over the land. And as I mentioned at the top, these impacts are not limited to the boundaries of your property. If you have a low-lying land and you build a hill on it, the water that used to collect in that land is going to rush off somewhere else, and it's probably going to be your neighbor's property. And so surface water management permits, the issue that they're trying to regulate and manage is that the ways that we develop and use our land doesn't cause essentially either minor or catastrophic issues with our water resources and our land uses. So let's see, that's kind of everything I wanted to say about that. So those are the three areas of regulation and kind of generally how they their general purpose and what they're trying to accomplish. Now I'm going to spend about the next 10 minutes just kind of going over issues specific to agriculture and water use, and hopefully this will kind of illustrate how a lot of these issues and these regulatory questions and concerns come together in the context of agriculture. So, what do you need for agriculture? Land. Takes land to grow things, and even with some of the real cool stuff they're doing with greenhouse production and vertical farming, that still requires some footprint of land. So you know, as I talked about with the surface water management thing, permits, when you use this land, you're going to affect how water flows across it. And so the way things work out too is that oftentimes some of the best land for growing things are wetland areas because their soils often contain great amounts of nutrients that help you, be highly productive in agriculture. The Everglades agriculture area, which most people in South Florida are probably familiar with, is a perfect example of this. It's was part of the Everglades, and in the 20s and 30s and 40s, 50s, we drained it to turn it into productive ag land, and it's still among some of the most productive ag land in the country. But that comes with a cost of we've affected the Everglades and those wetland areas and all the functions that those wetlands provide. So when you are thinking about agricultural land and agricultural production, you have to think of wetland permitting and land use issues, and increasingly, one other additional issue that's cropping up is arable land. So a lot of development is in otherwise arable land, and not all land is suitable for growing crops. And so when people talk about arable land, they're talking about land that can produce crops. And as the climate has been changing and the world developing, we have been losing significant amounts of arable land. So maintaining agricultural practices that maintain the land's ability to produce food for long periods of time is also of significant concern. And in areas like the Everglades agricultural area, that directly intersects with water use, because the soils there, if they're left dry, they oxidize and they go away. And so part of the management of that land that they've come to learn is that you have to keep the soils wet for most of the year. And so that requires a certain amount of water. And where are you going to get that from? And a lot of times it rains, but also from Lake Okeechobee. So that's like kind of a snapshot of all of the land considerations that happen. And one more that I kind of just mentioned, but land use laws. As we developed, we've kind of encroached on a lot of agricultural land. So that presents a whole set of issues in and of itself. People move out to the country because it's beautiful and they have open space, but they might move near a farm. And so there's some friction there between agricultural practices and, kind of modern day living, what we're accustomed to. The next issue is actually directly water, like water use, having enough water to produce, fruit and vegetables and animals. So that intersects with consumptive use permitting as well as surface water management. So you need you need the water when you need it, and you don't need the water when you don't need it. So you have to have, in a lot of places, you have to have a way to apply water to the land where you're growing your crops. We're lucky in Florida, we get a lot of rain, but at the same time, even still, there are times of the year when it's too dry, and in order to produce stuff, we need to add water. So usually that comes from wells or surface water management systems. And those surface water management systems can also be used to drain the land, because in Florida, we also get a lot of water in short periods of time in the summer. That creates a lot of issues, especially with planning, because as I mentioned in the beginning, agriculture uses quite a high volume of water to produce these things. And agriculture has gotten more efficient over the years, but if you still look at the big pie, it's a big slice of that pie of water uses. So in a place like Florida, where we have millions and millions of people moving into the state because it's a beautiful place to live and retire and recreate and all that stuff. Those people need water too to shower and for their lawns and things. And so when you're looking at, as a farmer, your water, your concern with water isn't necessarily year to year. You're looking 5, 10, 20 years down the road, because a lot of the investments you have to make to produce food, you have to make them, and your hope is to get returns over 5 or 10 or 20 years. And so to justify those expenses, you need some amount of certainty. And so that's creates a really difficult tension between how much water cities need, for their citizens, and then how much money the farmers need, or how much water the farmers need. And it's a really tough, difficult issue. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a little bit. Let me check my time. I tend to talk a lot as an attorney. So the next big issue is pollution. So there are several areas of concern with water pollution and agriculture. The one a lot of people are familiar about that has been a big concern in recent years is nutrient pollution. And so that basically comes from the fact that as agricultural production developed through the Industrial Revolution and through World War II, we developed a lot of methods to make production much more effective and efficient and produce a lot more on land with a lot less resources. But those methods involved adding nutrients to the soil. And when we add nutrients that don't get used by the target plant, whether it's our citrus or whatever, our potatoes in my case, those nutrients don't always sit right where you put them. If you get a big rain in the soil and you have the right conditions, those nutrients will leave the land. They'll leach, and that goes into local water bodies and can cause problems. And, not the least of which is it causes algae blooms, and it can cause invasive species to take hold, as I've seen down in on the Miccosukie's land, but also throughout the greater Everglades. And so that's one area that I think a lot of people are familiar with. I'm not going to talk about it too much. If y'all want to ask questions at the end, I'd be happy to answer more questions about that issue. Another pollution issue comes with pesticides. So when pesticides, they really started to develop early in the late 19th, early 20th century, and a lot of the first pesticides, commercially produced pesticides, they had really long half-lives, and they would stay in the soil for a really long time, and we found out that they would be, there's all sorts of serious health consequences for both wildlife and humans. And so over time, we've developed pretty stringent regulations on pesticide use, and we've in fact banned a whole list of pesticides like DDT and things like that. But those issues are serious, and in Florida, there's the legacy of that still exists. And if you buy a piece of property and want to develop it, you should get, you should look at the property and the soil to make sure there's no type of contamination, because a lot of old agricultural sites still have some legacy. And the folks that were using those pesticides back then, it wasn't their intent to cause that harm in most cases. They didn't know, but the fact is it's there now. And so the question then becomes, how do we deal with it? Okay. And there's one other big, okay. The other issue is food safety. And so those first two water quality issues were kind of like, the way I see them are things that, agriculture does that is like a negative impact for the people outside. The third one is food safety, and so this is a real a concern, an issue that's kind of internal for farmers, because as our water resources become more and more constrained, we have more demand on our limited resources. There's a lot more pressure to reuse water, and reclaimed water in the context of agriculture carries with it a different set of issues. One of which, primary one, is that it can be a vector for diseases that can hurt your crops. So that's a concern. But then another concern is kind of public perception, in that a lot of reclaimed water is, it's water that we used, that's been processed from human waste. And so even though the water might be clean, there's a public perception that, oh, you're growing my lettuce with essentially toilet water. I don't want that. And so the people who are buying the produce don't want that either. And so that causes resistance to using that reclaimed water, which, right or wrong, it cuts out a source of water for agriculture to use that can kind of cut down its slice of the pie as we, so we can be more sustainable. Let's see, how am I doing? Okay, so I want to close with kind of like the big picture of all this stuff, and then I'm going to open up for anyone who has questions. I know I hit like a lot of areas, and this is a broad range of topics, but the big point I'm trying to make and illustrate is water's fundamental to society, and especially our ability to produce food that can sustain this type of populations that we've grown to. And the problem is that there's no simple issue when it comes to managing water in a sustainable way, and protecting it, and protecting the resource, keeping it clean. And these issues don't exist in isolation, as much as people will often try to portray them. Water, whether we realize it or not, it ties us together, and the way we use the water affects all of our neighbors. And so if we want to be able to protect that resource and sustain the society that we build, we need to approach these issues with patience, understanding, and humility, but also determination, because we can get along. We can say, I understand that this water is polluted, let's work together. But there's going to come a time when, once you identify an issue, whether pollution or overuse or something, you need to be determined to come up with a solution that not everyone might like. So that requires some determination and leadership. But hopefully we can do it in a way with empathy that doesn't disproportionately hurt people unnecessarily. So in order to do that, we need regulations and public officials to focus on long-term solutions as opposed to expedient short-term fixes. Solutions to sustaining a clean supply of water, as well as a reliable supply of food, require collaboration across political and geographic boundaries. And that is not an easy thing to do. And there's countless examples where people who are fighting over things demonize each other, and communication breaks down, and you just end up with a big fight. If we want to solve water problems, we have to approach it with a sense that we're kind of all in this together, and none of us are going away. So we need to work collaboratively on these things with patience and understanding. So I'll quit talking there, and if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them to the best of my ability.
That's That's great, Christopher. I don't know if my mic is on or not. I'm just taking a chance. Um, we'll open it up to questions now, and we'll just let you field those. And I'm asking Kendra to let us know when we have about 5 minutes left, so we can wrap it up. And thank you again. So we'll open it up to questions now, Kendra. If you want to turn on the mics and let the folks in. I noticed there's a lot of questions on the chat screen that I have up here. So here we go.
Kendra, if maybe you want to read the questions in the chat.
Yes, sure. So Chris, we have a few questions. The first question is from Anthony. Anthony asks, does FDACS track the amount of arable land and water needed for agriculture? And how do the water management districts interact with the FDACS?
That's a good question. They keep, well, I don't know if they actually have, total arable acres. They do keep track of the acreage, and the USDA actually also keeps track of acreage that's in production. And, I haven't spent any time working at either FDACS or the district, but I have worked with a lot of folks who work at both agencies, and in my experience, they get along reasonably well. That's the case with most, kind of public servant, non-appointed people that work at the agencies. They often get maligned, but most of them are really smart and really dedicated and do a pretty good job. If I can put my plug in there for employees of agencies and the scientists and other public servants that do the work. So yes, they track it to a certain extent. I don't know about the total arable land.
Jeannie also had a comment. She said they work with former farm workers who were exposed to DDT and other legacy organochlorine pesticides, who have chronic health issues and autoimmune diseases that have been linked to agricultural occupational pesticide exposure. So she also commented that they are interested in more sustainable agricultural methods that can include everything from cover crops, multi-cropping, using less pesticides and fertilizers, and building the soil so that it holds water better to reduce the need for extensive water irrigation. That was a comment from Jeannie.
I realize there's not really a question there, but I'll say a few things about that. I'd like to thank her for that comment. That was something I was thinking about as I was thinking about what I was going to talk about on this. And since it doesn't directly deal with water, I didn't touch on it much. But she's absolutely right. There's there's a long legacy, and a pretty serious history when it comes to farming labor, and most obvious being the legacy of slavery. Like, so much of agriculture was done on the backs of indentured servants. But even into modern times, there are serious issues with how agricultural labor is treated on every level. The type of protections that we offer them, the resources at their disposal for health impacts and other things. And there are, there's a lot of the farms and the farmers that I know personally do a pretty good job, and they genuinely have concern and empathy for all their employees, whether they're farm managers or migrant labor working in the fields. I grew up actually, one of the many jobs I had on the farm, I would work, next to farm, migrant workers. I picked onions, I graded potatoes, and that's some of the hardest work that we ask people to do in this country. And it's a pretty thankless job, and it's not an easy thing to do day in and day out. And so I guess I said all that to say that that is important. Those are important issues, and I would encourage you to keep working at them because these things typically progress slowly, but it takes dedicated people paying attention to them and working on them to make real change. So anyway, thank you for working with us.
We do have another question, which is anyone working on guidance for farmers to grow crops that need less added water?
Yes, actually, so that's a great question. The one that there are several people that are. The big one in Florida is IFAS. So they're with basically the University of Florida. It's their extension service, which they provide a lot of support and resources for agriculture of all sizes, from really large commercial operations, down to people who are gardening. And before I became an attorney, I worked very closely with IFAS at the time I was trying to grow potatoes with micro irrigation. So IFAS was a huge resource for me in helping me understand research that was out there to effectively, water needs for potatoes, and the focus was finding more efficient irrigation methods, less than varieties of potato that use less water, because at the time we were doing flood irrigation, which isn't a very efficient irrigation method. So the low-hanging fruit, excuse the pun, was to focus on our irrigation methods. But I can say that there are a lot of people working on those issues generally, being more efficient with water, from the types of crops produced to the way the water is used. And Florida for a while was kind of behind the ball because, kind of a victim of circumstance in that we have an abundance of water that falls year round, some of the most in the country. And so the people who, when I was doing a lot of my research on drip irrigation, the people who were kind of leading, at the edge, the tip of the spear, so to speak, on the technology were places where they had little water. So Israel, Jordan, places in the Middle East where they have virtually no water. So out of necessity, they've developed very efficient methods. And so again, that's another example of how we can learn from people on the other side of the world, to solve these problems. But yeah, thank you for the question.
So that seems to be all the questions we have in our chat box. If anyone who called in would like to ask a question, just push the star and then 6 on your phone.
Kendra and Christopher, I have a question. I don't know if you can hear me or not. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There's issues and controversies in other states, and I think I've heard bits and pieces of it here about rainwater retention and control of rainwater. I believe Colorado has some very restrictive legislation that prevents homeowners, property owners from collecting their own rainwater for use on, ornamental plants or even in their own agricultural activities. Do you have any insight into what's happening in the state of Florida on that? If anything.
Maybe a little. That hasn't been as big an issue in Florida yet that I'm aware of, primarily because, again, we're lucky in that we have so much water. We have such an abundance that, from rainfall and also from the aquifer. But yeah, the issue of collecting rainwater is really interesting, and again, it's it gets to this thing of the problems are always much bigger than your individual property, because surface water is just rainwater in most cases, other than where springs are. It's rainwater that's fallen somewhere and then collected, filtered downhill and collected in larger and larger streams and rivers, and gradually it makes its way to the ocean. And so, if you're a homeowner, in say Boulder, Colorado, and you put out a rain barrel, in isolation, that doesn't look like much. But if you have hundreds, if not thousands, of people collecting some rainwater on their property, that's going to actually prevent a lot of water going into a watershed. And the way our water rights have developed is that there are people downstream who actually rely on that water. And so that's where the issue and the tension kind of develops. And like in Florida, we haven't, that tension hasn't risen to a point where I don't know, I could be wrong, but there might be some local municipalities who have issues with that. But so far, we've been lucky with an abundance of water that it hasn't really risen to such a serious issue as you see in a lot of Western states.
Yeah, that ongoing discussion.
Oh, yeah, yes, and it's something to be aware of, because again, it's like another illustration of how these things are tied to like larger issues that are larger than just ourselves.
Absolutely. Well, that was wonderful, Christopher. Really insightful and detailed, and yet also engaged with the specific issues and questions that people have. Most impressive. I think I speak for everyone on the call right now. We just have a couple minutes left. Kendra, do you have any last observations, comments, or instructions for us?
Well, just thank you so much, Chris, for your time and presentation today. Thanks everyone for being on the call with us. We will be posting the recording of the call on our website and our YouTube channel. And if you would like, to join our next forums, we do these every month. We do have special forums sometimes, so check our website and check our Facebook and follow us. And we're so happy that you were all able to join us today.
And Kendra, before we close, I also want to just remind people that the forums are the final Friday of each month at 12 o'clock. And on May 15th, we're going to have a very special forum that's going to deal with COVID-19 and the pandemic and how that's impacting the Florida food system. Kendra, did you have anything on that to share at this point?
For that special event, we're going to be posting that up on our website this weekend. We'll also have that up on Facebook. So all the information on how to join will be available this weekend. And
that'll be May 15th, a special forum. So that being said, Christopher Johns, thank you for being with us. Thank you for inspiring us and also sharing incredible background information about the state of water in our state and its impact on society and especially on agriculture. It's great to know you, and it's great to have you with us.
Thanks, it's my pleasure. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Kendra.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great day.
Yeah, y'all too. Stay safe.